Look at that, the music. That's pretty high tech right there. The music fades.
I control all the buttons. It's awesome.
Hey, let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into the topic of discussion today. God, thank you for a time to get together for us to discuss the wisdom that you give to us through your scripture, through your life here on earth, and help us to take that information, interpret it, and be able to use it for a direct impact on our lives, and especially today as we talk about integrity in the work environment. In your name I pray, amen. So we'll start with the homework, and this is just the same thing as if you were sitting in the church service in there and you hear something, you're like, okay, so what is it that God puts on my heart that's supposed to be an action that I would take with a particular eye towards, well, what might I do, just something in this next week in relation to other people, all right? So just keep that in mind as we go through. That's the homework assignment. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. So my work experience is a corporate work experience for 26 or 27 years. That's at a large financial company. So my lens and my background and some of the stuff I'll share is from that environment. So might have to stretch some applicability into your own work environment, but that's where I come from. Now, 1 year of that, after my job went away, I actually did work on staff here at the church for 1 year. I was the executive director here for a year before we hired Cliff, or right. You were on my way out. We were like, okay, we need somebody like Cliff, and so I was actually on staff here for a year and then returned to the same financial institution. I enjoy at work. I work for Fidelity. So if you see like a Fidelity.com, or if you have a retirement account, a lot of those websites are what I work on, and so that's the majority of my career. Although some of it, 3 years of it, was actually spent in HR doing leadership development. So I really enjoy leadership development. I enjoy coaching, and so that's a little bit about my work experience. So the stuff you'll hear probably has that slant to it. My family is, I have 3 kids, 2 in college and 1 a senior in high school, and so that's like that is my major stressor in life. Work isn't as much as adult kids, getting them, like kicking them out of the nest. And then my wife has been on staff here at NEC a couple of times in the Kids Zone capacity, and now she works for Bethany Christian Services and runs a chunk of that nonprofit, which is also actually has offices here at NEC. NEC, so my background is I actually was part of the first group of people that helped start NEC. So I judge the age of NEC by my oldest son, who just turned 21, so NEC is now of drinking age. And a lot of the stuff that I've learned and have applied in the work environment has actually benefited from the practice and things I was able to try out in this environment. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And one comment about the 301 series is I'm thrilled that we have this and we do this. NEC puts a very, very high value on the experience of a comfortable environment for people to come, listen, and the criteria for success on a Sunday morning is somebody who's a visitor says, I'd like to come back, right? So that's where the bar is at. We try really hard to make that safe. However, you actually need an environment where you then dig in deeper and actually have conversations to say, well, what is God really teaching about this? And so it's like Sunday mornings, and then a 101 would be a, hey, tell me a little bit more about why you do these things. 201 is, similar like a college class mechanism. That would be, let's roll up the sleeves a little bit more. And then 301 is, let's drop the gloves. What is it that God is teaching us about this subject, right? So if you take giving and generosity, it's out there, it's, hey, you know what? God is generous. You should consider being generous. 101 says, actually, generosity is this, and maybe consider being part of giving to something, including to church. 201 says, no, actually, you should really take seriously taking part of your income and your time and actually giving it, and actually then increasing that over time. And then 301 is, you know what? None of this is ours. You live as a sacrifice because this is all God's. You're just a steward, right? So that's kind of like the progression of depth of discussion. So as we go through this and we start to talk about 301 topics, feel free to jump in and ask questions, because this is really about, well, what is it that God's looking at behind the scenes and really wants to teach us, okay? So with that said, this particular talk today, last week when Tracy was here, she talked about faith at work in the context of looking at yourself. Okay, she talked about some work-life balance topics. She talked about being your authentic self at work. You know, really coming with who you really are and how you show up. She talked some about introspection and personal development. And so if you weren't here, I'd encourage you to go watch it. The link will be available at some point. It's on YouTube. So she was focused on how do you bring yourself to work. Today we're talking about how do you focus on others in your work environment. And then next week, Kelly's going to be talking about, well, how is our relationship with God impacted at work? And how do we bring God into that environment? So I encourage you to be here next week for Kelly's talk. So that's just a little bit contextually of what we're going to talk about. So today's really more about others. So here's a guiding passage from Romans 12. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-informed maturity in you. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. And there's three things that we're going to discuss in relation to other people. So I chose like three topics that for me have been very impactful to keep on my mind about living faith out in the work environment. The first is, how do we approach conflict? And I hate conflict. I personally like to avoid it, but in that work environment, you spend about a third of your life in these work environments, and conflicts come up all the time. And how do you address those in a way that is God-honoring? The second is the role of generosity and service in that work environment. And we'll talk a little bit about why that, for me, has been an impactful thing about me in my work environment with other people. And the last is a concept of servant leadership and how that is what Jesus' example is, and how that actually fits for me, actually seeing that play out in a work environment, and how you can live out your faith that way. So just to raise the hands, how many people are good at conflict? In case we need to call on you. Okay, Lori's good at conflict. You're good, that's all right.
Not causing conflict.
Well, I mean, you got into all of it, right?
Very,
You don't.
very much so.
I'm learning this year.
You've learned this. You know, and actually one generic comment from anybody that you ever see trying to teach something or being up front is a lot of what I might say today is from the failure experience. Not from wow, I have this mastered. It's from here's what I've learned as I've stumbled. So this one for me is a tough topic. Remember, years ago, when there were the two-way pagers, right before cell phones. We had these two-way pagers, and I was on a conference call in one conference room, and people were on the phone. The meeting gets over. Everybody leaves the conference room except for me and one person, and I spent the next 10 minutes complaining about somebody on the phone call. I mean, it was pretty obvious how not flattering I was being towards that person. And my pager goes off. I open it up, and it's her. And she says, "Chris, I'm still on the conference bridge, and I hear everything you're saying." Right, that, kind of blood drains down, and it's like, okay, I have to address this conflict. And that actually prompted me to, not prompted me, I had to. I said, let's go sit down and talk about it. And it was a very, very difficult conversation, made certainly difficult by the mistake I made, but it was really important for me to address that conflict. Fast forward, about 3 years later, that person sat down and said, "You know what, will you be a mentor for me?" Blew me away that she wanted that, and I reflected back on you know what, I just didn't handle that conflict situation the right way. And so for me, I always go back to that particular setting and try to remember what it was that caused me to not jump into that conflict. So here's a scripture verse that NEC actually uses in our commitments about each other, and then how you might apply this in a work setting. All right, so it's from Matthew 18. It says, "If a fellow believer hurts you," right? So that's a little bit different. We're not actually talking about fellow believers, but the principles I think still work. "Go and tell him, work it out between the two of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take one or two others along with you, so that the presence of witness will keep things honest, and try again. If he still won't listen, tell the church. If he won't listen to the church, you have to start from scratch. Confront him with the need for repentance and offer, again, God's forgiving love." So I mention this because this really is a model for how to address people in conflict. It's not necessarily as cut and dry in the work environment, because you're dealing with a lot of other dynamics. So some of that aspect of where the church fits in obviously doesn't apply. But part of how would you go about addressing conflict does. So there's a couple principles that we can pull from that. One is to go direct to the person. Now, I'm not good at conflict, like I said, so my techniques for this are different. I usually take, I'm going inside my gut, and I know I have to address it. So I take this long runway of, I send them an email, "Hey, we probably should talk." Then I instant message them like, "Hey, I'm going to set up a meeting, and here's why." And then I send out a meeting invite. Now other people will be like, "Just pick up the phone and call them." And for me, that's just not a comfortable thing. So I rarely just pick up the phone to call. But eventually, I get to the place where it's like I actually do have to address this one-on-one. So as uncomfortable as it is, that's really the first principle that God's talking about in that passage. And like I said, even at NEC, if you ever have brought a problem to Cliff or brought a problem to Mike, and you say, "I've got this real problem," the first thing they're going to do is have you gone to that person directly. And if you have, that's going to be the starting point, as uncomfortable as it is. The next thing is to assume good intent, and this is really kind of a strange thing, because I used to be part of this tenseness between these two parts of our organization. There were two groups, probably about 20, 25 people in each of them, and they were set up to inherently have a conflict. One was a creative development group, and the other was a group whose job it was to protect the integrity of that website. And there was always this tension, because these folks were trying to creatively change something, and these guys were trying not to ever, ever, ever have it break. And it created this tension. And brought somebody in, and we had a 2-day offsite of just working through that conflict, because that's how deeply embedded it was. By the end of 2 days, 49 out of those 50 people had that aha moment of, oh, that other person actually thinks they're doing something right for the good. They actually believe that what they're doing it's actually the right thing. I may disagree with them about what they're doing, but I at least know that their intention is right. Now, one of those 50 people didn't get it, and I'm not sure where his intent was. So assuming good intent isn't always the case. It's not like everybody does have the best intent. There are people that might be out there and actually have some ill will. So it's not, people are imperfect. But if you start with assuming good intent of that other person, then that will start to break down barriers. The other thing is to stay away from gossip. And this, for me, is the easiest, slipperiest slope out of any of them, because it's so easy to talk about somebody else with other people. And it just makes you feel so good that I am right and they're wrong. And I'm validating that with Kelly. I'm validating that with Kathy. And I feel more right the more other people I talk to. And we know from Scripture, although it's implied in the Matthew Scripture, that just doesn't work. It deteriorates relationship, period. And so for me, it's a very, very difficult one to steer clear because it's natural. Also, one of the values at NEC is, I find it more difficult in the work environment because it's almost second nature to let yourself talk about somebody else instead of keeping that quiet. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you struggle with gossip. And then the last thing is there are places where you would then engage others if and when needed. I would, similar to Matthew 18, I'd say probably a peer first. Grab a peer of yours, whoever you're having that conflict with, and actually invite them into the conversation. There are other steps that I've had to take as well, which is there's a next step, which is engaging the boss or engaging maybe HR. I've had those situations happen. But the point is, if you need to, then pull somebody else in. So the integrity of the relationship that builds from that way to address conflict is that I'll go back to the woman who eventually asked me to be a coach and mentor to her, because I finally actually did some of these things. I actually, from that point forward, we were always honest. Sometimes I did have to bring other people in because I thought she was wrong on some things. And that did actually mean we had conflict, but we had more of a trusted relationship, even through conflict. So not easy to do, but definitely an important core piece, because this happens all the time. I'm confident you guys have stories of conflict in your work environment that have been uncomfortable and necessary to work through. All right. Any questions about conflict in the workplace? Again, one of the more uncomfortable topics, but
actually, I might ask, how do you deal with conflict with the boss? Because like a lot of those, like the Matthew 18 assumes parity, right? It seems sort of an equality between the people. But if the person overseeing you would go to complain to.
yeah. So anybody else want to address that first? I'll jump in, but anybody have conflict with boss that they've had success working out, and what was it? Yeah. So I would put that in the category. First of all, great that you didn't gossip, because it would be really easy to do that, and you would now be spinning down in the repairing of the he said, she said thing. And one is to take time to actually understand what argument you're making. And as somebody said, I heard speak, they said, well, argue as if you're right, but listen as if you're wrong. And And so you have to do that in that particular situation, and then say what are the facts and try to make it unemotional. Other aspects of dealing with your boss where there's conflict is, and this is tough, it's being empathetic, right? So you get putting yourself in their shoes and trying to understand where they're coming from, and then trying multiple techniques to communicate to them. Hey, you know what? I need to sit down and I need to talk through this with you. And so you actually, with a boss, you have to go after them probably 3 or 4 times in different ways to try to get over that communication barrier. If you try those 3 or 4 techniques and it doesn't work, then there are avenues of others like HR. And in that case, before that, I would seek a confidant outside of the realm that you're working in to bounce the topics off of, because we're always going to be tainted to our own situation and our own emotions. So getting some outside thought, even before going to HR, is a helpful thing. I would usually do that with somebody outside of work, or completely removed, like they have no idea what we're talking about. So those are a couple things that come to mind. Any come to mind for?
Yeah, I've noticed over the last few years, I think through doing a lot of writing and stuff on myself and that, but I'm very aware of the attitude I go into with conflict. My first reaction is blame. Look what you're doing or what you said. But when to the grace of God, when I stand for 1 second even and just say, look at myself here, what am I ready? Am I ready to, you know what I mean, just attack, or am I ready to take a deep breath and just say, I need to talk to you in regard to this is how I feel when you say something. And for me, it's working, because I remember reading years ago, attitude is the father of every action we take. And when we walk in the door, when I go into a meeting or whatever it is, I'm aware of the attitude that I walk in with. Am I ready to make somebody feel small? Am I ready to, prove that I'm right or whatever? And it's become a blessing in many ways because it works, it's simple, but yet it comes out that neither the person that's, like I have a little thing now going on with my supervisor. I feel she doesn't support me, and she supports all our project managers. But I'm aware of my role in this because I feel inferior. I feel that, basically my anger or my attitude towards her is, give me a break. You have no concept of what I do. But I know, again, if I walk into her with this sullen attitude and blaming, I know her attitude. I know her. She will defend herself to the hilt. So basically, for me, conflict is be aware of the attitude I go into it with.
I think that's a lot of wisdom. That's a lot of wisdom in there. That self-awareness is really difficult to achieve, and it's difficult to hold up a mirror for somebody to say, you really should do this before you go into that situation. I wish I could have taped, actually we did tape that, because that snippet was awesome. Hopefully this picked it up.
Yes, I like the 2 examples that we just shared. They're both helpful, and what they reinforce for me is that I think, at least in my experience, and most of the time in conflict, at the kernel of it, is a lack of information. I feel very grounded in terms of my point of view, which is right, and I'm well intentioned, and I love your thinking here about good intent. And it's so funny how that's like automatic for others. Not so much you have to get to that for others' efforts, but inevitably what we're missing in conflict is I don't know why the other person feels the way that they do. I know they're saying why they feel the way that they do, but I don't know why it is that they feel that way. And so my challenge in conflict is to go in with the spirit of curiosity, because I'm really interested. I'm interested to know what is it about their view I really don't have insight on that I need to get insight on. And that's a 2-way conversation as well, because if I'm thinking about somebody else, I also have to take accountability for, am I sharing why I feel the way that I feel, or am I just going out there with my message? And so trying to get to that, not what you feel, but why you feel is important.
Good stuff. Good stuff. It would be great if we could get rid of conflict altogether, but I'm actually pretty sure that that's not what God.
One thing we didn't say was who would pray first. Either to yourself or with them if they accept it.
Certainly with yourself. Which is an interesting bridge, Lori, the way you said that. It's an interesting bridge to this next topic that I want to go through. I work in a very politically correct environment, meaning it's a large corporate environment where there's this weird assumption like it's the separation of church and state, and that faith discussions have very little. The environment that I am, I feel like that's a taboo. It's not against policy, but it is this thing that says it feels like, well, it is about as strong a separation of church and state. We don't do that here. So preparing myself during the day with prayer versus praying or bringing up a topic in that context, it's almost never for me brought up in that context. So that's a two-way street of how I've grown up in this particular company. So that's a backdrop for this topic of generosity and service. And it's something that I learned kind of maybe only over the last 10 years, just kind of the value at this. So if I go back a step, when I think about bridging into somebody's life with and enter into a faith conversation, it's for me always done with and through relationships. So I am a relational evangelical type of person. I am not beyond that. It's all about relationship first. And I think that that's an imprint of NEC and Mike and Chris on me over the years, which is you can talk and you can teach, but when care about the relationship first, and then a lot of doors will open. And I sat with a pastor of mine when I was first graduated from college, and I was in the workforce, and I didn't like my job, and I thought, I want a job in ministry. And I sat down with my pastor at the time, and he said, Chris, you should consider that what you're called to is giving. And you should consider that if you want to try new things, volunteer. And it's completely not what I wanted to hear. What I wanted to hear is him saying, yes, you should go back to school and you should get an MDiv and you should work in ministry. I don't know what I wanted him to say. But I didn't like his answer, and I don't think I was mature enough to hear it. But what he said was, consider the value of giving and consider the value of service. And so it just kind of stuck with me, and I started to move down that path. A guiding passage here from 1 Timothy. Tell those rich in this world's wealth to quit being so full of themselves and so obsessed with money, which is here today and gone tomorrow. Tell them to go after God, who piles on all the riches we could ever manage. To do good, to be rich in helping others, to be extravagantly generous. If they do that, they'll build a treasury that will last, gaining life that is truly life. And so what I found then over the years, that in the work environment, to bridge into a relationship, these things are what I call gimme putts. That talking with somebody about generosity all of a sudden is this leap into their personal life that they aren't necessarily willing to open up otherwise. It doesn't come up naturally. So I'll tell you the first time I learned this, and I'm not proud of this, but we had a tendency on the teams that I was working on to be very sarcastic, like bitingly sarcastic, and not so great language. So we created the sarcasm swear jar. Anytime somebody was in my office and they were sarcastic, they had to put $1 in. And anytime they were in my office and they swore, they had to put $1 in. It got filled up. It got filled up quite a bit. What that did was we said, so what are we going to do with money? And we said, collectively, we have to figure out what to do for good with this, not to go out and buy beers after work. And it got down this thread of it created this engaging conversation about, well, what should we do? It was like $100. And all of a sudden I saw that it let everybody's guard down, and they started to talk about things that mattered to them outside of work. Sometimes you talk about your family, that clearly matters, but this was this new arena. So the next year, when it came time gifts that I might give to the team members, what I did was I gave from my Fidelity that I work for has a charitable account. I had money that I set aside in there, and I gave them each $100 to give somewhere. And the system allowed me to do that. And I said, my only requirement is that you write on my whiteboard, give that money. And we kept on my whiteboard a list of essentially charities that meant something to them. Alzheimer's, because my mom passed away. Food pantry, this. Church, this. And all of a sudden, it just brought down this new level playing field of conversation that I'd never really experienced before. So that was really important, because it was integrity on display, right? People were, when you talk about something you're going to give your money away to, it's something you feel passionate about, and it probably has a value behind the scenes. And then it builds relationships. And then the second thing is we would start to talk about service. And people would sit to me and say, I really want to grow my career. I want to get promoted. I want to learn this. I want to learn this. And what I would do is I'd say, you know what? At work, here's a couple of things that we could do for you to get that experience. And what about volunteering? Where are you going to next? And it would stop them in their tracks. They're like, what do you mean about volunteering? And I went back to what that pastor had said to me, which was, try new things in service. And I've learned as much working at and with and people at NEC as I have at my work environment. Skills that I had not developed, I had helped develop here. And so that was a very interesting thing, because what it did was it automatically said that it's not just work where you can develop yourself. Service is important. So that's a personal value coming across. And then work-life balance, which we talk a lot about, actually becomes real. You can't actually do service and expect somebody to be working 70 hours a week. So if I, as a leader, say, I expect that you're, at least considering doing something service, that's outside of work. All of a sudden it was, oh, you really mean work-life balance. You're not just saying that, but then expecting that I do a work environment where I actually can't have time to do that. And all of a sudden you see this relationship start to build. That's when some barriers come down, and if the barriers come down far enough, then God's invited into that relationship and conversation. So those are two things that for me have worked in that work environment. That again, when I was younger, I didn't think that the pastor was right. Not that we were questioning pastors, but I thought I wasn't mature enough to understand what that principle was. And then the last one here is servant leadership. And the verse here, and I won't read through it, is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So we have an example in Jesus that is like the pinnacle of a servant leader. And however, in the setting that I work in, a hierarchical, power-controlled system has been more common of the way things have been structured. And that's changing more and more and more. And it's like, okay, so now the business gurus start to get the idea that says, hey, we're on to something new, although it's been around from a business point of view since kind of the 80s, it started to get talked about. But now these companies have to work in a different way, a different environment, a fast-paced environment where they're starting to see we need to work differently. And they're starting to realize that servant leadership actually is beneficial. That is a leader coming in and actually, instead of always being the top-down power control, to actually picking and choosing the places where it's, you know what, I'm going to take that. I'm going to lead the way because I'm here to support the organization. I'm here to support you. There's a picture on another page with kind of the inverse hierarchy, and that's actually what a servant leader is. And when I show you what the principles of a servant leader are, it's actually, you actually see, well, that's Jesus. That is how he led. So he was, sitting with people in the power sectors of his time, and then he was washing people's feet. So think about that dynamic of how he led, and it's completely reverse of that kind of hierarchical power struggle that a lot of organizations have. So a couple things here, like who is a leader? And here I'm actually talking about people who have followers. So it's not like I have people who report to me, hence I'm a leader. These are people who are, through their work and their actions, people seek out and say, I'd like to follow what that person is doing. So it's not just, so everybody can be a leader in how they go about work. And Andy Stanley uses something he calls moral authority. I changed it here to character authority, which is if you live this godly character, people are going to be drawn to you, and hopefully they then can't poke holes in how you're leading, and so they're more likely to be drawn to you. I think Tracy said something last week where somebody came to her and said, actually came around and said, are you a Christian? And she said yes, and she said, well, that explains it. Well, it explains what? That she never said that, but she was living that way through her actions, and then that person connected the dots, said, that's why. A good servant leader doesn't do swoop and, who's ever heard the management strategy, swooping poop? That's a manager who comes in to a bad situation, poops all over everybody, and then leaves. So it's called, you never heard of that management style? Swoop and poop. And we've all had leaders and managers who have been like that. They come in when there's a problem, they get all over your case, and then they're out of there. And you never see them until there's another problem, and they come and get on your case. So this is swoop and help. I mean, a servant leader swoops in the right places, helps, and then moves on, right? They're not there to do all the details. But, so it's just a new, don't be a swoop and pooper. Okay.
Is that just something that you made up, Swooping Poop, because it's supposed to be something else now?
Because it rhymes, if you look it up, swoop and poop is actually what they would they would say. Because it doesn't rhyme. Swoop and shit.
Put $1 in the jar.
Yeah, put $1 in the jar. And then the last thing here is EQ, or kind of this emotional intelligence, is really important. So maybe we'll finish with this. And if you think about, so these are what some people say there's 8 principles of servant leadership, some say 12. These are a list of 10. And if you think about that in relation to others at work, and think about how Jesus lived his life and his example of how he interacted, servant leadership is what Jesus' example was. And to the extent that these are the principles that you could think about as you're going into your work environment and saying, these are actually how I want, that's what I want to be doing with others, that's basically being Jesus' skin in the workplace. And so there's a few opportunities now with the current business climate, as competitive as it is, to live by these principles as what God really wants us to be doing with others. There's 5 minutes left, unless we need to end right at.
Whatever you want to do.
So I'd say kind of completely open-ended Q&A discussion for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll let you off to, yeah, everybody's environment is different and everybody's style is different of like, so how do I get, what's important to me across? And how do I live that out? We all have our different techniques and styles and work environments. And interesting that, the small work environment has those same taboos as a large organization. And it's like, okay, so what are all the unwritten rules in that environment? What can I do and still have good relationships? That's going to be different probably for each place where we're at. And it's amazing how much I'm sure people see that example, and that's contagious.
Absolutely.
You're changing your work culture at the most micro places has very, very powerful. If they see you doing that, that's contagious. Negative is contagious too. So it's like, but positive is just as contagious. It's like, oh, absolutely. The next person, that commercial where somebody does something nice for somebody, and that person then does it for somebody else, and it comes around full circle. It's kind of a neat, 30-second commercial. That's really very powerful stuff. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the time. It's 10 o'clock. 10:01. Mike gets upset if people aren't in there right at 10, right? Yeah.
Thank you.